Chapter 2 is called Bases of Power, and the subtitle is Organization and Ethnic Resources. So basically, we're going to be looking at where does power come from. So let's get stuck in then. So from page 17, we read there's a quote at the beginning from someone called Alvin Toffler, a book called Power Shift. And it says this: over-concentration of power resources is dangerous. Under-concentration of power resources is equally as dangerous. Conflict is an inescapable social fact. Power struggles are not necessarily bad. Interesting. So let's read. These are Brother Amos's words now. We give thanks for this great ancestor. For social power to be exercised effectively, the power holder must possess or control some important or valued material and or social resources, which is the basis of his power. By strategically rewarding or depriving others of these resources, he may use them to influence behavior in ways compatible with his interests. Resources, when used for such ends, is referred to as power bases or power resources. Power bases or power resources may include physical safety, health and well-being, wealth and material possessions, jobs and means to a livelihood, knowledge and social skills, social recognition, status and prestige, love, affection, social acceptability, a satisfactory self-image, and self-respect. Dye, so an author called Dye, rightly cautions that power is not a quote-unquote thing exclusively possessed by an individual or group, but essentially refers to the nature of a relationship between individuals, groups, and institutions within a social system in which some individuals or groups have applicable control over certain vital or important social and material resources needed or desired by others. So it's about control over key bases of power. That's the key thing. Not over every single base of power, but the key bases of power, which enable them to, wield control over other groups or individuals. Social power is exercised by, Toffler in 1990 asserts forthrightly that, quote, because people have needs and desires, those who can fulfill them hold potential power. Social power is exercised by supplying or withholding the desired or needed items and experiences, unquote. A power relationship, and I've highlighted this paragraph when I read it before, so let's see why I did that. A power relationship and the inequality between the parties in such a relationship presuppose that the weaker party either lacks appropriate power resources or relatively fewer of them, or if he possesses them, does not possess the will and or the ability to employ them effectively in his interest. So I think I highlighted that because it's bringing us nuance to the fact that it's not necessarily that an oppressed group doesn't have power, but it could be that that oppressed group doesn't either realize that it has the power, or more importantly, doesn't have the will, the collective will. Not enough people in that group have the desire or want to, to take control of those bases of power to, use it in their interest. So that makes sense. We're on page 28 now. I said 17 before. It's page 27, sorry, before. So we're on page 28 now. We have no intentions to review the quite sizable number of possible power bases here. We shall constrain ourselves to brief but pertinent discussions of those power resources which are of permanent relevance, of important relevance to African Americans and the power relations between them and European Americans. These power resources include property, organization, race consciousness, and ideology. So you notice there that some of those things are, well, one of those things is a physical thing, property. And I suppose property can even be intangible. But most of the other things, organization, you could say, is kind of more of a social structure. Race consciousness is all about consciousness, and ideology is, you think of ideology as ideas, a system of ideas. And I listened to Amos Wilson's Blueprint for Black Power lecture earlier today while I was doing some driving, and that's one of the points he makes. He sort of makes really clearly in that lecture is that don't think of consciousness and ideology and these sorts of things as abstractions, because actually those things, without consciousness, there is no world. You need consciousness to for the world to exist in our, to humans, basically. If you can't perceive the world, if you're not aware of the world, then can we say the world exists? I suppose he's saying. But the more important point he's saying is that the way that we think, the way that we perceive the world, our consciousness, the level of our consciousness, actually has very direct, real life implications, even on a physical level. And he talks about it, how even the physical body of ours is directly shaped and even created and recreated by our consciousness and by the consciousness of others around us. And English Girl 234 said, I think we have to give ourselves agency to take power through knowledge and financial resources. Those with more have more responsibility. Yeah, I would agree with that. Some people will find that a little bit scary. Peace and blessings to you. Everything is politics, by the way. Welcome aboard. Some people will find that probably won't like that, and they'll think, oh, that sounds a little bit black capitalisty. But you're never going to do anything until we have to do. This is all about a blueprint for Black Power. This is all about action, and absolutely that those, certainly those with more have more responsibility. Although I would say that one of the greatest strengths is when you have a lot of people who maybe don't have much, but pull their resources together, and then that turns into a big thing. That's kind of like the basis of a lot of the ways in which modern nation states are organized, isn't it? When you think of taxation and all this sort of stuff. Yes, a lot of taxes come from the rich these days, but that wasn't, I don't think, how it was, how it was, say, 40, 50 years ago, before the rich started stealing at such a faster pace from the masses than they did previously. But so you got these bases of power, which Baba Amos says he's going to focus on, are mainly intangible. But then he goes on to say this: we do not include state politics in our discussion at this juncture, because in the context of contemporary African American social, political, and economic culture, and the more basic issues it must resolve, state politics is of secondary importance to the Black community. And a lot of people won't like that, but this is just common sense to me. One sec. This is good. I think I shared this on my channel a couple of weeks ago. Black politics and activism, without the Black ownership of and control over primary forms and bases of power, such as property, wealth, organization, etc., is the recipe for Black political and non-political powerlessness. The rather obtuse pursuit of political office and the ballot box as primary sources of power by the Black community and its politicians, without its concomitant ownership of and control over important resources, has actually hindered the development of real Black power in America. More ominously, there appears to be a paradoxical and positive correlation between the number of Blacks elected and appointed to high office and retrogressions in the civil and human rights extended to Black Americans during the past 20 years. Increases in homelessness, poverty, unemployment, criminality, and violence in the Black community, disorganization of the traditional Black family, inadequacies in education, increases in health problems of all types, and a host of other social and political ills have all attended increases in the number of Black elected and appointed officials. That is, the more elected and appointed Black politicians, the more socio-economic problems the Black community has suffered. We are not, this is important to listen to, we are not implying, where is it? Sorry. Oh, yeah, sorry. While we are not implying a causal relationship between the increase and the number of Black appointed and elected officials and the increased misery indices of the Black community, we are implying or asserting that their increase obscures those things which are responsible for and do little to ameliorate or uproot the increasing prevalence of social and economic problems in the Black community. The community's concern with the election and appointment of Black political figures helps it to maintain false hopes that their attainment of office will significantly resolve its problems. The activities of Black politicians, given the current inadequacy of social organization and economic resources, harmfully distract the Black community's attention from recognizing and eradicating the true causes of its problems and the remediation of its powerlessness. So, goodness me, that barely needs any comment there. I suppose just the key thing to say, he's not saying that the more politicians that we get elected to office and so forth, the worse it causes things to get worse. But he is saying, and I agree fully with him, that the Obama effect, or the, what's her name, Kamala Harris effect, or in the UK the Diane Abbott, we've got, what's her name now, Kemi Badenoch, a Nigerian British woman who's now, I think she might be favourite to take over the Conservative Party once they get kicked out of power in the UK in the next election next year, because it's a foregone conclusion. That blinds people. People think, oh, good, everything's fine, we can chill, we can relax, everything's good. And it's driven, isn't it? It's driven by the integrationist mindset, which just wants to see more Black faces in positions of power. And obviously we're encouraged to do this whole diversity and inclusion movement of probably the last sort of 5-10 years has really encouraged a lot of African people to put all their eggs in that basket. And all it does, what he says there, remember, he's writing there in the 1990s, the late 1990s. So we're talking about what happened from the 1970s to the 1990s, the increase. And the same thing happened here in the UK. From the 1980s, suddenly we had a whole bunch of Black members of parliament. And, as it's gone on, there's been more and more and more and more and more. You see a lot more Black faces on the benches of parliament, and even on the front benches of the executive wing of the government and stuff. And things are getting worse, frankly. Things are getting worse. So there we go. Peace, Kaisorian Empire. One of the most prolific live streamers I've basically ever seen on YouTube. So peace to you. I wish I could, approach anywhere near the level of prolificity, whatever the word is. But shout out to you. Thank you for joining. And everyone, again, just make sure you like the video if you are with us. And we're on page 29 here. We're going to carry on. We shall presently look at ethnic groups whose economic, educational, social, and political progress in America have been phenomenal and often surpasses that of Black Americans, yet who have not acquired one elected or appointed official to high political office. We will... Kaisorian is streaming now. What is going on? This is like some kind of madness. Streaming addiction. Sorry, where was I? Yeah, so you've got these other groups who have got all these social and economic advancements in the absence of even one elected official. We will see that it has been and is their effective acquisition and application of more fundamental power values or resources, which are far more responsible for their progress and power than their political electoral activism or lack of it. In our ensuing discussion of the bases of power, we will therefore put first things first, and Black American politics as usual is not one of these. And it's the same here in the UK. I believe the number of black MPs in the UK is higher than the number of, for example, Indian MPs, possibly. And yet Indians in the UK are, according to various social indices, usually higher, quote unquote, than certainly than black Caribbeans and black Africans, and yet black Caribbeans and black Africans, I believe, have more elected officials. I may be wrong in that, but there you go. So, page 29, property and power. So, Baba Amos Wilson is now going to go through those important bases of power, which are much more important, much more primary than electoral power. Again, he's not saying that electoral politics and activism is not important, but he's saying that that is not a foundational base of power. These are. So property and power. And again, this is going to set some alarm bells because, property, oh God, what is he going to talk about? Buying businesses and this, that, and the other. I mean, he might do, I can't remember, but I'm sure Baba Amos is going to give us a very nuanced and careful treatment of this point. It seems apropos at this juncture to emphasize a statement made by Thomas Dye. Quote, "Power is never equally distributed. There is no power where power is equal. For power to be exercised, the quote unquote power holder must control base values." Unquote. Inequality of power in social systems is correlated with inequality of the distribution of power resources within them. The distribution of power resources is rarely, if ever, randomly distributed among the individual and group constituents of a society. As we have already intimated, inequality of power between individuals and groups must devolve from their unequal share of important or relevant resources of power, among which include property, wealth, organization, social prestige, social legitimacy, number of adherents, various kinds of knowledgeability and leadership skills, technological skills, control of jobs, control of information, ability to manipulate the symbolic environment, and ability to apply force and violence. And all of that list there was from Michael Parenti. It is the first two items on this list that we shall now briefly discuss. Property, wealth, and power, page 30. Property and wealth represent a class of power resources commonly referred to as economic resources. As Dye contends, quote, "Control of economic resources provides a continuous and important base of power in any society. Economic organizations decide the basic economic question, or who gets what," unquote. Economic power is the power to decide what will be produced, how much it will cost, how many people will be employed, what their wages will be, what the price of goods and services will be, what profits will be made, how these profits will be distributed, and how fast the economy will grow. Again, that's from Dye. In capitalistic America, the foundation of economic power is private property, whose ownership not only refers to real estate, but also to the ownership of the so-called means of production, of accumulated capital, i.e. factories, machinery, etc. Wealth, surplus production, or surplus material goods as belonging to private individuals or groups instead of to the people or nation as a whole. Racial and class domination fundamentally involves the unequal interaction between the owners of property and wealth and the propertyless and poor, the greater power residing in the hands of the first group. So they who own those bases of power, they who own the means of production, and this is very, means of production is a Marxist phrase, socialist phrase. And I think a lot of people will be quite surprised at how positively Baba Amos Wilson speaks about some of these Marxist concepts in this book. You don't often hear people talking about this when they're talking about Baba Amos Wilson. But again, unfortunately, people don't tend to read carefully, and you pick out the things which fit your pre-existing beliefs, and you tend to ignore those things that can't quite so easily fit into your kind of framework. The concept of property in advanced capitalist societies is complex, Property resources are owned by private individuals and private institutions rather than the society or government, i.e., private property is one of the central defining characteristics of capitalist ideology and societies. The private ownership of property refers to far more than the ownership of concrete things like land, houses, factories, personal items, production tools, machinery, and the like. Property also refers to rights and interest and claims in and to things, to certain privileges relative to things, people, and activities. And let's carry on. This includes property as a right of use or disposition. The private ownership of things, rights, and claims as property, combined with the right and the freedom to negotiate binding legal contracts, permits private persons or businesses to obtain, control, and employ and dispose of property resources as they see fit. So we're kind of talking here about systems, aren't we? We're talking about systems of ownership, not just the actual things that are being owned, but the fact that those who own most of the main, means of production get to write the rules about how those means of production will be used, how those means of production will be, what are the ways in which you go about obtaining those means of production. I think of intellectual property as an example in this regards, that when you look at, I don't know, Baba Amos might talk about this in the book, but when you study intellectual property, you'll see that that's one of the most important things that the United States has led, in particular, over the last 30 years, to force their system of intellectual property rights onto the entire globe. And of course, most of us now think that, oh no, intellectual property is just a law of God. It's just a law of nature. It's written in the stars, but it's really not. And it took a whole load of cajoling and bombing and invading and all this sort of stuff, a lot of influencing through things like the GATT, I can't remember what, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which turned eventually into the World Trade Organization. They loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of years and years and years of debates and discussions to get to a point where, for example, even China wholeheartedly shares the system of intellectual property rights, because obviously these people are far-sighted and they understood in the 80s that we were entering the computer age, we were entering the digital age, and we would get to a point where, for example, digital assets would become much more important than as important as physical assets. And also, you think about things like the ownership of natural resources. Monsanto, Vandana Shiva, an Indian academic, has written a lot and talked a lot about how this whole privatization of seed, privatization of DNA of plants and all this sorts of things, to basically turn farmers into slaves. So extremely important, extremely important. All of this stuff.